listening to the Heartland Author Podcast. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For the 20th episode of this season of the podcast, I had the honor of interviewing Branch Isole. Branch is an author and poet who has written numerous books, including Christian poetry collections and erotic poetry collections. Branch is also the author of the nonfiction book Pathways to Publishing. I'm here with Branch Isole. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
You sure did.
Who is an author and poet. Branch, welcome to the Heartland Author Podcast.
Aaron, thanks for the invite. It's great to be with you. I've been looking forward to this time together.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners.
Sure, thanks so much. I'm an author, I'm a writer. I do short stories, poetry, articles, essays, just about anything other than novels. I've been writing for about 25 years. I've published 22 books and ebooks, and I never thought I would be an author until it happened.
Now, without spoiling too much of your books, what are some of your books about?
Well, my fiction books are basically about adult contemporary life and the kind of situations that we get ourselves in, the emotional impact of those situations, a lot about relationships, struggling relationships, loving relationships, interaction relationships in terms of race, age, just the things that readers identify with in their own lives, either from first-hand experiences or family experiences or work experiences, but subjects and themes that every reader can quickly identify with. And that's the gist of my fiction. My nonfiction books, I have 2 about spiritual grounding and growth, and I have 1 about the process of self-publishing, and then the 4th one is about intimacy, especially for men.
Now, having looked at a listing of your published works on Amazon, you've written an interesting combination of Christian works and erotic works. This might be the stupidest question I've ever asked anyone on this podcast. But how much overlap is there between the group of readers who are interested in your Christian works and the group of readers who are interested in your erotic works?
Well, believe it or not, there's quite an overlap, because both of those things, the Christians, of course, come prepared and come expecting. The erotic works probably is more of a inquisitive type of journey to see what it's all about. I had this question a couple of times, and people say, well, how can you blend the two? Well, I write about life, and both of those subject matters are part of life for all of us, basically. Sex is part of what we do as human beings, and the quest for spiritual fulfillment or spiritual grounding, or at least dabbling in that area at some point in our lives, is something that just about everybody experiences depending on their own depth. So the crossover may not be as great as one would think, but certainly the divergency is also not as great as one might think. Even the erotic material is fundamentally based on relationships, right? It's not like a romance novel or those pulp fiction novels. This is about what is intimacy, what is sex, what role does it play in our lives, and then what's the impact or the fallout of that activity.
Now, your nonfiction book about the self-publishing industry, Pathways to Publishing, was published back in 2010, which is 12 years ago. How has the self-publishing landscape changed since Pathways to Publishing was published?
Well, it certainly expanded. At that time, there were not many ebooks being published. That was just in its infancy. When I started publishing, it was back when traditional big houses, the old traditional houses, were very adamantly against self-publishing because they thought that it was going to eat into their market. Well, what happened, of course, is it did eat into their market. And so like all industries with a history, you either grow or die, and the way you grow is you assimilate and become part of what becomes new, or the avant-garde. So when I started publishing, I was on the outside, battling for a spot. And today, self-publishing or vanity publishing, having somebody other than one of the large, well-known houses is just as viable, as it could be. So it's the whole industry has expanded. The internet obviously has opened up the availability. Ebooks have added a whole wrinkle to the publishing arena because so much of the ebook market is available for free. So it's done quite a dramatic alteration of what self-publishing, initially started as, in its reaction to having to be part of the big publishing scheme of things or not published at all.
Now, according to the listing of your books on Amazon, you haven't published a book since 2011. Do you plan on writing more books in the future?
Well, some of my books are not in paperback, and they've been published, between then and now. They're available only as ebooks at this point. I currently have 2 books that I'm finishing up. One will be available in January, late January, and the other one will probably be released in the late spring or early summer. One is nonfiction and one is fiction.
Oh, okay. Now, if you have a typical writing routine, what is that like?
Well, I'm blessed that I don't have another job, right? That's all I do. I'm a professional writer. I don't have to have another income. My day in writing, I write practically every day. And I usually get up about 3 and I start writing, and I'll write for 5 to 6 hours. I'll take a break about 9, have some breakfast, take a walk with my dogs, tend to my chickens, do some things outside, and then I come back in the late afternoon and finish up whatever I've written that day. And so that's my day. It normally takes me between 6 and 8 months to write a book, and then the editing process, proofreading and editing takes over, and that normally runs anywhere from 8 to 16 months. So any book that I'm working on is generally a 2-year project.
Now, are all the books you've written self-published, or are some of them traditionally published?
Well, the very first one was traditionally published, and after I went through that process and found out how much of the legwork still was on my back and how much they did, I decided when that contract expired that I would just republish that, and then since then I've self-published every book.
I find it interesting that you actually went the traditional publishing route first and then went into self-publishing, because previous guests I've had on here who have done both started out self-publishing and then got accepted for traditional publishing.
Right. Well, there's a contractual situation that you have to decide whether or not works for you. and then there's also all of the follow-up. What traditional publishing offers most authors is, some kind of an advance, and then some kind of initial support, and depending on how well the book does, that will determine how much continued support the author gets. For self-publishing, virtually all of the responsibilities, all of the tasks, and all of the control, other than the actual printing of the books and having an outlet for distribution, everything other than those two things falls on the author's back. So it's a lot more work. There's a lot less control issues that you have to contend with other people. It's sort of like being an entrepreneur. You call all the shots and you make all the determinations. You do all the work, and then your reward is greater per book depending on how many sales you have.
Now, what are some of the rewards and disappointments you've experienced writing and publishing books?
Well, there's many. Like any other endeavor, when you start out, you learn a lot of things that you shouldn't do or that don't work for you. And you start to hone not only your practice of writing, but you start to hone, all of the other ancillary tasks that have to be done. You have to have, you can't do it all alone. You've got to have help, and that means you've got to have an editor, you've got to have a proofreader, at least one. You've got to have, someone who can do cover art and graphics. You've got to have somebody who can do formatting and layout, depending on what the printer requires. So there's a lot of technical type of after the book is written, but before the book is published, there's a lot of tasks that have to be addressed. And, however many of those you can do, you obviously try to do yourself. The ones that you are not capable of doing, you have to outsource and hire someone competent and professional to take those over and get your finished product. So there's a lot of decisions, there's a lot of obstacles. One of the great things and one of the bane of a writer is when you think you're finished and you're ready to go and you publish your book, and all of a sudden you discover a mistake, and that's just a killer, because you think you've done all of the legwork and all the homework, and it's like seeing the forest in the trees, right? There's that one that you missed. So there's just a lot of cost and expense kinds of lessons to be learned. There's a lot of technical lessons to be learned. And my suggestion for aspiring writers is, if you're only going to write one or two books, then you need to examine all of your avenues of publication and choose the one, obviously, that's the best value for you. And if you're not picked up by a large publishing house, I think that the most efficient way to do it is to go with what they call vanity press, where you've got someone who's going to take your manuscript and do all the things that need to be done for a set price. If you do as much as you can do, then they'll pick up all of the other tasks that need to be accomplished before publication, and you end up with a finished product in your hand. That's usually the best value, depending on the cost involved. But if you're only doing one or two books, from a time standpoint and an investment standpoint, I think it's the best route to take. If you're doing multiple books in a series, or different kinds of books in different avenues or genres, I find the self-publishing is a better way to go, at least for me, again, because I have the control, and with each book you learn something new, and you can continue to whittle down your costs until you get it all down in a process where you know exactly what it's going to cost you to get the book finished and out.
Well, Branch, were you not finished answering the question?
No, that was it.
Oh, okay. Well, Branch, You were a wonderful guest on this podcast, and I thank you for appearing on the Heartland Author podcast.
Aaron, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate the time.
Branch was a wonderful and insightful guest for this podcast. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to write your imagination. Bye for now. You can learn more about me and my book writing projects at campaaronapollo.wixsite.com/authoraac. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at authoraac and on Instagram at aacscribe. Copyright 2022, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited, except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.